It started with a door sealed for centuries, deep beneath the oldest stones of the Vatican. No one knew why it was built, or why it was never meant to open. But then, one quiet morning, it did. And what they found beyond wasn't just history, it was something stranger. A hidden world of forgotten sketches, missing bones, windows that follow the moon. In this journey, we're not just visiting sacred halls or ancient libraries, we're stepping into the places time tried to bury, where paintings fade on purpose, and music plays when no one is there. If you enjoy unraveling mysteries in the quiet dark and drifting off to stories the world forgot, subscribe now. There's a lot still hidden, and we're just getting started. Leonardo's Forgotten Journal. The journal wasn't found by accident. It wasn't stumbled upon by a careless worker, buried in dust beneath a forgotten shelf. It was hidden carefully, deliberately, in a narrow crevice behind stone shelving inside a lesser-known archive chamber deep within the Vatican. They said the room hadn't been opened in over a century. The air was dry, still, untouched by modern light. The monks who managed the archive weren't even aware the wall was hollow behind the shelving. And yet once it was removed after a quiet inspection for structural decay, there it was, a wooden box, ancient and cracked. No ornamentation, no markings, just a single seal, not papal, not Roman, but a tiny sketch, barely visible, of a flying man. It was Da Vinci's symbol, not his famous mirrored handwriting, not even one of his mechanical drawings, just a simple etching he had once used when signing private letters. It wasn't meant for history, it was meant for a single person. Inside the box were pages, tightly packed, written in a familiar but faintly different hand. Not Leonardo's, but someone close to him, someone who studied under him, followed him, and preserved what the master didn't dare publish. Historians believe it was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, often called Salai, Leonardo's longtime companion and student. But the writing didn't match his exactly either. Some scholars now suggest a second, more secret student, someone unnamed, a silent observer of Da Vinci's final years in France. The pages were extraordinary. They weren't like the notebooks we know, the Codex Leicester, the Codex Atlantics. These weren't scientific experiments or mechanical observations. They weren't anatomy studies or city planning designs. They were something else entirely. Dreams, sketches of machines he never built, descriptions of lights in the sky he could never explain, ideas he called impossible truths. One entry mentioned a structure buried beneath water, so old, he said, it predated the flood. Another referenced the movement of shadows inside the dome of Florence Cathedral, shadows that didn't follow the sun. One page, strangely described a meeting with a man who spoke no Latin, but knew the names of stars not yet named. Leonardo had written that entry in red ink. Only that one. And then no explanation followed. There were drawings of pyramids, Egyptian, yes, but also ones not matching anything ever discovered. One in particular had stairs that wound inward instead of upward, leading into the earth rather than into the sky. He wrote beside it, "Not all pyramids seek the sun, some seek the silence." The Vatican scholars debated for months whether to make the journal public. They feared ridicule. More importantly, they feared questions, because some of the drawings matched ancient artifacts stored in the Vatican's restricted Egyptian wing, objects never displayed. One of those objects, a curved piece of stone with intricate grooves, had once been thought ornamental, but a drawing in the journal matched it exactly, down to the cracks, and labeled it amplificatore. In modern Italian, amplifier. Amplifier of what? Sound? Light? Energy? The journal doesn't say. Leonardo only wrote that it was never to be used again, and yet he'd drawn a version of it, updated, modified with copper threads woven through its grooves. That drawing was dated the year before his death, and below it, written in faint handwriting not his own, "Master feared this one most, said it speaks even when silent." The journal was returned to its box, preserved in climate-controlled storage. A digital scan was made, but access is restricted. Only a few have read it, cover to cover. The Vatican hasn't spoken publicly about it. No press release, no announcement. But those who've read it say one thing over and over again. It doesn't feel like a collection of ideas. It feels like a warning. And now, after centuries in hiding, it waits. The mummies of the Holy City. The Vatican is not often associated with Egypt. The name alone brings to mind Renaissance paintings, papal archives, marble floors echoing with solemn footsteps. But beneath all of that, beneath the galleries and museums the public sees, there is a much older collection, one rarely discussed, and almost never displayed. It's not fiction. There really is an Egyptian wing inside the Vatican. Formally, it's part of the Gregorian Egyptian Museum, established in the early 1800s under Pope Gregory XVI. But there are pieces here that were never part of any public exhibit, not catalogued in museum brochures, not shown to visiting scholars, no placards, no translations. These were the artifacts considered too fragile or too strange. Most people don't know that the Vatican possesses over a dozen mummies. Some are in remarkable condition, skin like dried leather, hair still visible beneath cloth wrappings. A few have names: pharaohs, priests, women of high status, but others, they don't match any known burial style. One in particular is housed in a temperature-controlled vault. It's not Egyptian linen that wraps the body. It's a type of cloth that resembles linen, but under microscopic examination reveals tightly woven metallic fibers. No known burial custom has ever used that. The face is obscured by a strange mask, not gold like Tutankhamun's but dark green, almost stone-like, and fused to the skull. It was never placed on public display. The few who have seen it say the facial structure underneath doesn't quite match human anatomy. The limbs are slightly longer, the fingers unnaturally thin. When questioned, Vatican archivists insist it is an example of stylized burial, but a leaked internal memo dated 1963 describes it in colder terms. Possibly non-Egyptian origin, burial method unknown, remains exhibit unclassified traits. Where did it come from? There's no acquisition record, not even a note about when or how it entered the Vatican's collection. It's just there, filed away, under a code, not a name, and this isn't the only one. Several other mummified remains are stored in sealed drawers. One is labeled as child remains, but under X-ray analysis, the skeleton is far too dense for a child. The bone density suggests someone or something much older, perhaps even centuries old at the time of death. Another body is covered in strange circular carvings, not tattoos, not painted symbols, actual carvings etched directly into the skin while still alive, some form of ritual, a punishment, or a mark left behind by those who buried it. There's one case that Vatican researchers won't even open anymore, not because it's dangerous, there's no radiation, no toxins, but because of what happened the last time they did. According to unofficial reports, when the glass seal was broken, a strange scent filled the room, not the usual must of age and dust, something metallic, sharp, almost electric, and then the lights flickered. For a full 12 seconds, every bulb in that lower wing dimmed and surged. No explanation has ever been given. The incident was quietly logged and the chamber resealed. The mummy inside hasn't been touched since. Only a faded tag remains beside it, handwritten in Latin, "Not of this place." None of these mummies are on public view. Visitors to the Vatican museums will never see them. Tourists walk by the entrance to the Egyptian wing without realizing what's stored just beyond the barriers. A silent row of forgotten dead, some from Egypt, others perhaps not. There are rumors, quiet ones, that the mummies weren't found in Egypt at all, that some were recovered from excavation sites in southern Italy, buried in stone tombs that predate Roman conquest. Others may have come from under the Vatican itself, discovered during renovations in the 1940s and 50s when the city was being reinforced after the war. No records confirm these theories, but no records disprove them either, and so the bodies rest, wrapped in mystery, labeled in secrecy, stored in a place of faith, yet surrounded by questions that challenge everything the Vatican stands for. They say silence is sacred, but here, in these cold chambers beneath the city of God, it's also unsettling. Silent saints beneath the streets. The streets of Vatican City shimmer in daylight, filled with tourists, cameras, sunlight bouncing off marble statues. But beneath all this movement, far below the surface, there's a silence that doesn't belong to the modern world. Few people think about what lies underneath. Tunnels, corridors, tombs. Centuries ago, long before the Renaissance, long before St. Peter's Basilica touched the clouds, there were only graves here, carved into the earth, narrow and uneven, dug by hand, dug in fear. These were the catacombs of the early Christians. Not grand mausoleums, not open places of worship. These were secret sanctuaries, underground cemeteries, carved out of the soft tufa stone, layer after layer beneath what would become the holy capital of Catholicism. It wasn't just a place to bury the dead, it was a place to hide the living. In the first few centuries after Christ, Rome was a dangerous place to believe. Christianity was not welcome, and so believers went underground, literally, beneath the villas and roads, down into darkness, carrying their prayers into hidden chapels carved from rock. Here they gathered in candlelight, they whispered their gospel, they left symbols, carvings of fish, loaves of bread, anchors, symbols they hoped would outlive them. Some of these spaces remain untouched, closed off for safety, forgotten by time, but others are still accessible, barely, tight winding halls where only one person can walk at a time. The air changes the deeper you go, thicker, colder, and laced with a kind of stillness that's hard to explain. It's not just history down here, it's something more than that, because some of the tombs don't look finished, some corridors don't end, they just disappear into the rock, as though the digging stopped mid-motion, as if whoever was carving left in a hurry. Archaeologists have found strange etchings on some walls. Not Latin, not Greek, a language no one has yet translated, just rows of looping symbols, carved deeply and precisely, in corners where no inscriptions should have been. And then there are the sealed vaults, small rooms bricked over in ancient times, without any record of who or what was placed inside. One in particular, discovered in the 1940s, had no entrance, no doorway, just a solid stone wall, but X-ray imaging revealed something eerie inside. Several figures, standing upright, not lying in burial, just standing, facing the wall. They haven't opened it. Some say they shouldn't. In another chamber, the bones of a dozen early saints lie in niches, some marked, some anonymous. But what's strange is the preservation. The bones aren't fossilized, yet show almost no signs of decay. One even had remnants of cloth around it, intact fabric thousands of years old. There are whispered stories among certain Vatican staff, of sounds echoing through the tunnels at night, of motion detectors going off when no one is present, and of inscriptions that seem to change slightly over time, faint lines appearing where there were none before. Some of this is superstition, but some of it has been logged, documented, and then, quietly removed from the record. There is one final room, hidden behind a false wall, known only to a handful of historians. It contains a single tomb, unmarked, heavy with dust, and at its base, carved into the floor in almost perfect circles, are the words, "For those who walk below and never return." No one knows who carved it, or when, only that the phrase predates the construction of the Vatican itself. The silent saints beneath the streets remain undisturbed, not because the Church has forgotten them, but perhaps because it remembers too well. And down there, in that silence, history still breathes. The lost pages of the First Bible, high above the marble floors of the Vatican Library, past security doors and vaulted ceilings. There is a room that few are allowed to enter. Inside, resting behind layers of temperature-controlled glass, lies a book that predates almost every version of the Bible the world has ever known. The Codex Vaticanus. Not just a manuscript, not just an artifact, but a whisper from a time when Christianity was still defining itself, when scrolls turned to books and ancient voices tried to capture the divine in ink and parchment. The Codex was written more than 1600 years ago, somewhere around the 4th century. Its pages are made from fine vellum calfskin, stretched thin and carefully prepared. Every line of Greek uncial script flows in perfect columns, penned by scribes whose names have been lost to time. No punctuation, no spaces, just flowing words, word after word, page after page. It is said that this Bible may have been among the very first attempts to compile the full Christian canon into a single volume. Old Testament, New Testament, one unified whole. But it's not complete. Dozens of pages are gone, vanished, and no one knows when or why. The surviving parts of the Codex are extraordinary. The Gospels, the Psalms, the Acts, the Epistles. But then somewhere near the end, it just stops. No book of Revelation, no formal conclusion, just a quiet ending in the middle of an otherwise carefully constructed story. There are theories, of course. Some say the missing pages were lost to time, damaged or decayed. Others suggest they were deliberately removed, perhaps because they contained content that didn't align with the doctrines later embraced by the Church. Then there's the most whispered theory of all, that the missing pages weren't destroyed, but hidden, tucked away somewhere in the labyrinth of Vatican archives, or spirited off to private collections, or placed in sealed vaults because their words held ideas that could unravel centuries of belief. The Vatican has never officially commented. They acknowledge the missing sections, but do not speculate. Some scholars who have studied the Codex closely noticed strange details, tiny marginal notes that seem to reference other, now lost passages, scriptural cross-references that don't line up with any existing books. And once, a scholar in the early 1900s reported seeing a page fragment tucked inside the Codex's back binding, a slip of parchment bearing verses not found in any modern Bible. That fragment was never seen again, but its description remains in a handwritten journal now kept in the library's restricted section. Even more strangely, the Codex's script changes slightly halfway through, as if a new scribe took over, but the second scribe didn't just copy, they corrected, modified. There are places where words have been scraped off and rewritten, not many, but enough to raise questions. What was the original scribe trying to say, and what was changed? Could these edits hold clues to what the missing pages once said? In 2005, a digital scan of the Codex was completed. Scholars around the world gained access for the first time, but in reviewing the scans, some noticed subtle differences from earlier descriptions. Things that were once visible now appeared faint or missing altogether. Were they errors in scanning, or had the Codex changed again? A strange pattern seems to emerge the longer you study it. The deeper you look, the more gaps you find. Questions in the margins, ink that fades where it should not, references to books that don't exist anymore, or perhaps never did, And yet, in its silence, in its mystery, the Codex Vaticanus remains sacred, not because it holds every answer, but because it reminds us how many answers we've lost. Somewhere long ago, someone turned the last complete page and began writing words we were never meant to read, words that now lie in the dark, waiting. The scrolls that time forgot. Somewhere beneath the stone corridors of the Vatican, in a room few will ever enter, lie shelves older than most countries, wooden, worn, and barely touched by time. Upon them are scrolls, thousands of them, bound in leather, wrapped in linen, rolled tightly into careful bundles, and sealed with wax that's long since dried and cracked. They don't look like much at first glance. No flashy gold, no gemstone binding, just old ink, old words, and quiet dust. But among them are stories the world forgot, or perhaps stories the world was told to forget. Not every scroll in the Vatican's secret archives is a relic of power. Some are simply curious. Some are lost memories. A few, however, are something else entirely. Records that were never meant to be read by anyone outside the highest chambers of the Church. Pages that question the very fabric of what we believe we know. In the 17th century, a Jesuit scribe recorded a curious event. He claimed that while transcribing older scrolls from the late Roman period, he came across references to Gospels of Light, documents supposedly written by early followers of Christ that described visions, strange symbols, and divine messengers with no names. He wasn't sure what to make of them, and after submitting his notes he was reassigned, sent to another monastery far from Rome. His transcription disappeared. No known copy remains. Just the mention of it in his private diary, which only surfaced centuries later. Then there's the letter from Pope Celestine III, written in 1198. A cryptic line refers to a dark star, unseen by most, yet casting its shadow over Rome. The original copy is sealed away, but scholars know it exists thanks to a facsimile made in the early 1900s by a visiting historian. He wasn't allowed to publish it, but he noted that the passage was unlike anything he had ever encountered in church documents. The tone wasn't theological, it was fearful. Another scroll, catalogued simply as Liber Ignis, the Book of Fire, was listed in the archives in 1874. 2 years later it vanished. No damage was reported, no theft, it was simply gone. Rumors say it contained records of rituals conducted in the catacombs beneath Rome during the 14th century. Others claim it included accounts of visions had by monks, visions of skies opening, and ancient voices speaking in tongues no longer understood. But since the scroll is missing, all we have are second-hand whispers. The Vatican says that many of these lost texts are apocryphal, unverified, or non-canonical. But what does that mean, really? Apocryphal doesn't mean untrue. It means unaccepted. It means controversial. It means someone somewhere decided that what the scrolls contained wasn't for us. There are whispers among researchers of scrolls that detail pre-Christian beliefs still preserved by early church leaders. Scrolls that suggest Jesus traveled further than previously thought, eastward toward the Indus. There are even claims of texts that describe a celestial event, a great sound in the sky, followed by the appearance of a fiery orb that descended and remained for days. No name is attached to this sighting, no explanation. The scrolls just refer to it as the arrival. Whether symbolic or literal, we don't know. And then, of course, there are the gaps. Entire collections noted in early catalogs that no longer exist. Scrolls referenced by scholars centuries ago, whose titles show up in marginal notes but not in the archive itself. There's a scroll marked only by its seal, a key crossed with a torch. No title, no author. The seal dates it to the early 1500s. It's one of the only scrolls kept in a temperature-controlled vault within the vault. Very few people have ever laid eyes on it. Why? Why the secrecy? The Vatican claims it's about preservation. Some materials are simply too fragile, others too incomplete to be useful, but that doesn't explain why they're sealed, why the metadata around them is encrypted, why visiting scholars, even with the highest clearance, are told politely but firmly not to ask about certain collections. There's something strangely human about that. The desire to protect what we don't fully understand. The fear that truth, raw, unfiltered, and unapproved, might be too disruptive, might challenge what we've built. So we seal it away. We let it gather dust, and eventually we forget it was ever there. Yet these scrolls still exist. Even now they sit in silence, bound in centuries-old twine, stored away behind layers of protocol and permission, waiting. Some of them haven't been touched in over 300 years. Others have been read but never discussed. Their contents filed into memory, then quietly returned to darkness. Imagine walking into that room, the air cold, the light dim, row after row of shelves, each filled with secrets that were never meant for the daylight. You pick up a scroll gently as if disturbing a sleeping animal. You unroll it slowly. The ink is faded but legible. It begins with a name you don't recognize. It references a place you've never heard of. It describes a ritual, Simple, quiet, meant to call upon something older than scripture itself. You don't know what it means, but you feel deep down that you were never meant to see this. And yet, here it is. You replace the scroll. You leave the room, but the memory stays. This is the strange paradox of the Vatican's secret archives. They are real. You can find the door. You can request access. You can see the records, but you cannot open everything. You cannot read everything. And you most certainly cannot share everything. Not yet, because there are still scrolls that time forgot. Scrolls that remember stories we've stopped telling. Stories that might change how we see the past, or ourselves. But for now, they remain asleep. Hidden beneath stone, behind seals, under layers of time and silence, waiting for the moment someone, somewhere, finally asks the right question, and listens for the answer buried in the old ink. So if tonight, as you drift to sleep, you feel a tug of curiosity deep in your chest, that quiet ache to know what was never meant to be known, let it be gentle. Let it guide you, not wake you, for the scrolls are still there, and someday their secrets may find you, when the time is right, when the stars align, and when silence gives way to the oldest voice of all, truth. The underground city of the dead. There is a silence beneath the heart of Vatican City. Far below the ornate floors of St. Peter's Basilica, under the golden dome and the polished altars, there is a place few speak of, a place older than the church itself. Before the bells rang, before the statues stood tall, before the saints were canonized, there were tombs, layers of them, tunnels and chambers where the dead were laid to rest, and where the living once whispered prayers in the shadows. They call it the Vatican Necropolis. Not a crypt, not a basement, but a true underground city, buried beneath centuries of construction, lost beneath the weight of history, preserved in a strange stillness, as if time itself had curled up and gone to sleep down there. It's easy to miss when you're walking through St. Peter's, marble shining, sunlight pouring through the windows. You'd never know that beneath your feet is a maze of ancient corridors, narrow alleys, and forgotten rooms, a whole world hidden just beyond the reach of light. The necropolis dates back nearly 2,000 years, a time when Rome was still an empire, and Christianity was still a whisper. The early followers of Christ were not yet saints. They were citizens, stonemasons, merchants, and martyrs, many of them buried here, side by side, in these hushed underground halls. Back then, the Vatican Hill was not a sacred place. It was a pagan cemetery. Rich Roman families buried their dead here. Lavish tombs with painted walls and sculpted reliefs, columns and altars to forgotten gods. But over time, something changed. The site began to attract Christian burials, quiet ones, hidden ones, as if the faithful had chosen this place not for what it was, but for what it could one day become. Some believe that St. Peter himself was buried here. According to tradition, after his execution in Rome, crucified upside down at his own request, his followers took his body and laid it to rest in the soft earth of this necropolis. No grand ceremony, no cathedral, just a simple grave, a fisherman turned preacher, buried in a borrowed tomb. Centuries later, when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and began building the first basilica on this hill, he did so with one goal, to enshrine Peter's grave. They built the altar directly above the spot, layer upon layer of stone, churches on churches, until the humble burial was hidden beneath a mountain of faith. For nearly 1,600 years, the necropolis was sealed, forgotten. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1940s, during secret excavations ordered by the Pope. What the workers found wasn't just a grave, it was an entire street of the dead. Mausoleums still standing, walls still painted with scenes of ancient life, names etched into stone by grieving hands, candle holders, coins, offerings, and the soft scent of time. Each chamber tells a story. Here, a Roman nobleman rests beside his wife, their tomb adorned with vines and birds. Just beyond them, a Christian woman lies with arms folded in prayer. The inscription reads simply, "In pace, in peace." Further in, signs grow bolder, fish carved into the stone, anchors, Chi-Rho symbols. These were the signs of the early church, coded for safety. This wasn't just a burial place. It was a sanctuary, a secret refuge beneath a hostile empire. Even today, the air down there is thick, quiet, like the city above has forgotten to breathe. Tourists aren't usually allowed. Only small groups, under strict supervision, pass through the narrow corridors. The Vatican guards the site carefully, both out of reverence and necessity. The structures are fragile, the temperature is controlled, light is limited. Too much attention would cause it to fade, and perhaps that's how it should be. Some places are meant to be whispered about, not shouted. Some stories are written in the dust between footsteps, in the slow drip of centuries, in the hush that follows a prayer. The necropolis is not a museum. It is not a ruin. It is something more delicate, more alive. In one chamber, archaeologists found the so-called Trophy of Gaius, a simple shrine built in the 2nd century, Small bones were discovered nearby, deep in the earth. Fragments. Ancient. Tests suggested they belonged to a robust man in his 60s, dating back to the time of Peter. Were they his? The Vatican has never confirmed it, but the bones now rest in a clear case beneath the high altar, as close as anyone might get to the foundation of their faith. The path through the necropolis is dim, the ceilings low, in places you must crouch, the walls close in, like time itself leaning down to speak. There are alcoves where you can still see soot on the ceilings from oil lamps, graffiti scratched in Latin, prayers from the desperate, names you'll never read again. This city of the dead has no map, no clear direction. You don't walk through it, you drift. Slowly, like water moving through forgotten stone. The silence wraps around you like a cloak. Every echo feels older than the last. There is no wind, no birds, just your own footsteps, soft, careful, and somewhere behind a wall, a saint may be sleeping, waiting. The deeper you go, the more it feels like the living world is slipping away. The basilica above becomes a dream. The chants, the choirs, the bright golden mosaics, distant. Down here, faith is quieter. It is not preached. It is felt, in stone and dust, in shadows and bones, in the spaces left between the names. And when you finally emerge, when the door closes behind you and you step back into the sunlight, you carry something with you, something heavy, not a burden, but a weight, the kind that lingers in your breath, the kind that humbles you, the kind that reminds you how many footsteps came before yours, and how many more still echo, beneath the floor. Michelangelo's hidden hideout, beneath the vast and echoing splendor of St. Peter's Basilica, down a corridor that most have never walked, behind a door that once stayed locked for centuries, there lies a room, small, shadowed, forgotten, a space carved not for worship but for retreat, not for grandeur but for hiding. This is where Michelangelo disappeared, alone, exiled, and in secret. The year was 1530. Rome was in chaos, power was shifting, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, sculptor of David, painter of the Sistine Chapel, was no longer just an artist. He had become a target. His support for the Florentine Republic, which stood against papal control, had made him a political enemy. When the Medici returned to power, his life was in danger. He vanished from public view, and for months, no one knew where he had gone. He was here, beneath the marble floors, beneath the basilica that would later house some of his greatest works. In this hidden room, barely tall enough to stand in fully, dimly lit by flickering candlelight, Michelangelo stayed hidden, alone with his thoughts, with fear, with time, and with chalk. The walls around him became his canvas. He couldn't sculpt here. There was no marble, no studio, but his hands needed to move. His mind needed to create. So he drew, with bits of charcoal, with pieces of red chalk, with whatever he had, onto the walls, onto the stone, onto time itself. Even in exile, his genius would not sleep. You can still see the drawings. They are faint now, softened by centuries, but they are unmistakable. A face that resembles the Christ of the Last Judgment. A hunched figure sketched in profile, anatomical studies, expressions, the silent workings of a mind that could never be still. There's a sadness in the lines, a heaviness in the strokes. These weren't grand commissions. They weren't meant to be seen. These were the private moments of a man who once carved gods from stone, and now reduced to silence, etched his thoughts in a hidden cave. The floor was dirt. The air was damp. He may have slept on a straw mat or a simple bench, day after day, surrounded by nothing but stone and fear, waiting for word from the world above, hoping not to be forgotten, hoping to survive. How long he stayed here is not exactly known. Some say weeks, others believe it was several months. But when Michelangelo emerged again, it was as if a new fire had been lit. He went on to complete the Last Judgment, to sculpt the Pietà Rondanini, to leave behind works that would outlive him by centuries. And yet, this little room beneath the Vatican was never mentioned in his letters, never described in any journal. It stayed hidden for nearly 500 years. Only in 1975, during routine excavations beneath the basilica, was the room discovered, sealed, quiet, still waiting. The walls spoke, not with words, but with sketches, with memories, with the imprint of a genius who had once vanished into the dark. Today, the room is rarely shown. Access is limited, protected, and maybe that's right, because this wasn't a studio, it wasn't a chapel, it was something more human, a shelter, a whisper, a confession written in chalk. When you look at the sketches, you're not seeing a masterpiece, you're seeing a man, a soul in hiding, a mind in motion, a hand that never stopped creating, even when the world had turned against him. In the quiet of that small underground space, beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's Dome, Michelangelo's ghost still draws, still watches, still waits, still waits. Letters from the Edge of Faith, in a quiet drawer tucked away beneath centuries of dust and silence. A stack of papers lay undisturbed. Their ink had faded, their edges had browned, but their words still pulsed like a heartbeat beneath old skin. These were no ordinary notes, no idle scribbles. They were the personal letters of Galileo Galilei, written not for the world but for himself, and for a God he both feared and questioned. Most know Galileo as the man who pointed a telescope at the heavens and saw truth in the stars, but what they rarely see is the man behind the telescope, the one who stayed up late, not just to chart the skies but to wrestle with something far less predictable, his faith. He believed in God. He had to. Born in a world where belief wasn't a choice but a structure of survival, Galileo grew up in the shadows of cathedrals and candlelit sermons. But belief, for him, was never simple, not after what he saw. In these letters, discovered buried in an old Florentine archive, Galileo confesses, not to crime but to conflict. His discoveries were not born out of rebellion, they were born out of awe. Awe that the moon had mountains, that Jupiter had moons, that the earth moved, and here's the part few speak of. Galileo wasn't trying to disprove God, he was trying to understand him, to see his fingerprints in the cosmos, to ask, quietly, if truth and belief could exist in the same breath. One letter, dated the year he first observed Saturn's strange rings, begins with trembling words, "Lord, I do not question your existence, I question how you work." In another, after being warned to stay silent, he writes, "They ask me to unsee what I have seen, but how does one unring the bell of truth?" It wasn't arrogance, it was pain. These were not declarations of defiance, they were admissions of a soul caught between wonder and warning, between what the church demanded and what the universe whispered. He never wanted war. Galileo was not a heretic. He was a man who loved both scripture and starlight, who saw no contradiction in believing the earth moved while also believing in divine design. But the world around him did not allow for such duality. Not then. One letter never sent was addressed to a cardinal who once supported him. "I ask not for pardon but for patience. The heavens do not rush, and yet they reveal themselves, layer by layer. Perhaps our faith should do the same." These writings aren't fiery or dramatic. They are quiet, tired, full of a longing for understanding. There are lines scratched out, sentences left unfinished. Some pages seem wept on. Others look like they were written in the dark. And through them all you feel it. The weight of a man caught at the edge. Not just the edge of scientific revolution, but at the edge of something deeper, something sacred. He was trying to make peace between two things that in his time were seen as enemies. But Galileo didn't see enemies. He saw a sky full of questions, and a heart full of belief, and he dared to think they could coexist. Today those letters sit behind glass, fragile and yellowing, but when you read them, it doesn't feel like the voice of a distant figure. It feels close, human, restless. We like to remember Galileo as a hero of science, but maybe the truer story is this. He was a man who stood in the dark, looked up and believed in more than one kind of light, and in the silence between those words, maybe just maybe he found it. The chamber without a key. There is a vein of whispered mystery running beneath every corridor of the apostolic palace. A hush that listens rather than speaks. And deep within that labyrinth, buried behind doors more ancient than memory, lies a vault known in legend as the chamber without a key. Locked for centuries, yet with no record of how it was opened or who opened it. Most who work in the palace pass within yards of its door each day, and never notice it. A simple wooden panel set into stone, unadorned, unassuming. Its only distinction a tiny brass plate, worn to dullness, engraved with letters now unreadable. There are no hinges visible, no matching lock. And that's the thing, no one knows how it locked, and no one has found a key. The first time anyone even realized it was there was in the late 1600s when workers repairing old floors discovered a sealed corridor. Underneath broken tiles, beneath centuries of marble dust, they unearthed a wall and a closed door. In the official log, a brief entry notes a door found closed behind the old chapel, but no key was ever catalogued, no map updated. The door stayed closed. Centuries rolled on. Renovations, papal transitions, political upheavals came and went, yet the door remained silent, forgotten by most, known only in obscure footnotes of restoration records, often dismissed as clerical error, but some never forgot. In the 1950s, a young librarian discovered a faded note in a Latin ledger. It mentioned the chamber that locks itself. She wrote about it privately, speculating that it was a relic vault, perhaps containing documents too dangerous to be easily accessed. But after submitting her report, she was reassigned to catalog manuscripts. Her report vanished. Then, earlier this century, during seismic tests in the vault below, engineers noted an empty space behind the wall, shaped like a small room. Immediately, bravery tempered by caution. Archaeologists were not permitted. Only watchers in suits whispered about a sealed cell under the palace, its contents unknown. Nothing was done, until one day. Permission. Quiet. Minimal. For a team of restorers to examine it. And so they approached the door. No key in hand. No ancient chronicle to follow. Just gentle taps. Light brushes to clear dust. and the slow scraping of mineral buildup. Then the unmistakable shift of wood within stone. A click, soft as rainfall. When it opened, the chamber did not shout. It did not glow. It waited. Still. Cool air breathed out in a soft exhale. Candles lay on low shelves. Some melted away into stone. Others blackened. And books, carefully bound volumes resting on wall niches. Old scrolls wrapped in wax-sealed parchment. No grand treasures. No flush of gold. Only quiet things meant to rest where no one disturbs them. What astonished the team wasn't what lay inside but how it was preserved, locked without a key, yet untouched. There were no signs of forced entry. No soot from torches. No cobwebs disturbed. Only a room recorded in blueprints, with a door never designed to open. Inside, one scroll bore only a single line. The pen without the seal goes silent. The ink was faded, barely visible. Next to it, a letter addressed to a cardinal, dated centuries ago, complaining of voices too loud for the halls of faith. The cardinal's reply, "Let this chamber rest." No one knows what instructions were followed, or whose idea it was to lock it forever. Some suggest it was closed during wartime, when advancing troops threatened the archives. Others whisper of disagreements within the church, of debates deemed too dangerous, and hidden until tempers cooled. The chamber remains today. Its door closed again, gently, not barred, not chained, because this time, those who closed it did so with understanding, not fear. When the door is opened again, if ever, the world may learn more of its secret contents, or perhaps it is better that some doors remain sealed, mystery preserved, history intact, faith undisturbed. Tonight, when the palace is still, and shadows gather under vaulted ceilings, a memory lingers, a memory of that click, that breath of air, that sight of pages untouched, a chamber locked without a key, whose silence remains the greatest secret of all. The hidden map of heaven. There are paintings that dazzle, and there are paintings that wait, quietly, patiently, in forgotten corners of sacred halls, their surfaces cracked by time, their stories buried under layers of varnish and smoke. This is the story of one such painting, an old fresco, found deep within a monastery cloister in northern Italy. A painting long believed to be purely symbolic, until a soft beam of evening light revealed something astonishing. It begins in a town most travelers pass by, modest, worn, but once, in the height of the Renaissance, it was a vibrant sanctuary for artists fleeing the chaos of Florence. One such artist, a figure shrouded in anonymity, left behind a single fresco, no signature, no known patron, just one wall-sized painting tucked away in a vaulted corridor few entered anymore. To the monks it was called the Ascent of the Virtues, a religious scene, a spiral of robed figures ascending through golden clouds toward a distant light. Angels hovered, scrolls unfurled. At a glance it looked like so many others from its time, an allegory, instructive but not unusual. For decades, restoration experts logged it only as early 1500s, artist unknown. Cracks had formed along the surface, but no major damage. It was dusty, dull, faded, but untouched. No one knew what they were overlooking. Until one summer evening, as the sun dipped low and streamed through a high stained glass window, the corridor flooded with amber light, and something strange happened. What had once looked like clouds shimmered, and the pattern of their curves, their spacing, didn't match any known Christian symbolism. An astronomer visiting the monastery noticed it first. He paused, then asked the question no one ever had. Why do the clouds form a spiral? When photographed under filtered light and digitally enhanced, the shapes no longer looked like clouds at all. They matched the star patterns of the northern sky, as it would have appeared in 1492. Not approximately, not vaguely, precisely. The painting showed constellations. Lyra, Cygnus, Cassiopeia, subtly embedded in swirls of gold and gray, but not as symbols, as accurate star positions, correct in both placement and relation, mapped using tools of astronomy that wouldn't officially be invented for another 50 years. The deeper they looked, the more the fresco revealed. At the top of the spiral, painted faintly into the background, was a cluster of stars that could only be the Pleiades. Below that, a rendering of Orion. But one detail stood out above all, a glowing circle at the center of the entire design. Not a cross, not a halo, but a disk, precisely aligned with the galactic center, as it would be viewed from Earth. This was no coincidence. The artist hadn't simply added stars for beauty, they'd embedded a cosmic map, and yet no documents exist explaining the fresco. No notes, no sketches, no surviving letters about its commission. The monastery records from that year are missing, pages torn out, ink scraped away. Whoever painted it, painted in silence, perhaps in secrecy. One theory suggests the artist was a student of Giulio Romano, or even of Leonardo himself, trained in both art and astronomy. Another possibility, a monk, one with access to astrological manuscripts, working in solitude. rendering the heavens not as myth but as geometry, a mirror of the divine order hidden in the stars. When ultraviolet imaging was performed, yet another detail appeared: inscriptions, barely visible between the painted scrolls, ancient Greek, not Latin, phrases lifted from Hermetic texts and the works of Ptolemy. As above, so below. The firmament is the path of the soul, not church doctrine but cosmic philosophy. What does it mean? Was the artist encoding a message, a secret understanding of the universe, or simply preserving a vision too vast for his time? And why in this place, this corridor no one walked anymore? Why paint a map of heaven where no one would see it, unless the light struck at just the right angle? Perhaps the artist believed that truth doesn't need to be seen by many, just by someone. Eventually. Today the corridor has become a quiet destination for those who seek the forgotten intersections of faith and science. Visitors come not for spectacle, but for silence. To stand before a wall that, under dim light, reveals nothing, but under fading sunlight unfolds the heavens. If you wait long enough, as the evening nears and the wind quiets, the patterns begin to return. Not suddenly, not brightly, but slowly, as though the painting were waking, and in that slow unfolding there's a feeling that maybe the artist wasn't only showing the stars, maybe they were trying to say something more, that heaven isn't only up, it's around us, patterned into the very sky, waiting quietly to be seen. Not symbols, not metaphors, stars, mapped by a forgotten hand, in a corridor few remember, in a monastery most have never heard of. And if the stars are a language, then maybe this painting was their whisper. The Watcher's Window. They say every masterpiece hides its own secrets. The Sistine Chapel, crown jewel of the Vatican, holds more than painted angels and heavenly scenes. High above the pulsing crowds and centuries of admiration, something else watches. Not part of any guided tour, never written in any official guidebook. A narrow vertical slit, no wider than a finger, carved into the wall just beneath the ceiling. It's called the Watcher's Window. If you've seen the ceiling's vast cosmic canvases, you likely overlooked this hidden slit. Few even notice it exists. For centuries, the window remained silent, known only to a handful of caretakers who passed through secret corridors, balancing prayer and duty. Most who walked those corridors believed it simply a quirk of old construction, a leftover from forgotten renovations. But it was far more deliberate than that. In the late 1500s, Vatican restoration notes mention a small aperture above the choir for official oversight. Most scholars dismissed it as clerical error, until an old ledger was found in a dusty archive. It referred to a stone eye placed to observe but not to be seen. It spoke of an observer, appointed, equipped, and sworn to secrecy. In the 1800s, during restoration, one of those observers entered the cramped space behind the window. He described it later in a water-stained diary, now hidden from public view. Inside he found a small flat bench carved directly into the wall. No room to stand upright, only enough to kneel or crouch. In front of him, the slim vertical opening like a watchtower slit. On the floor, an iron ring affixed into the stone, perhaps to secure a lamp or chain. And on the ledge, faint scratch marks, almost like someone had gripped it for years, watching, breathing slowly, living in stillness. The observer's notes mention that at dawn a single ray of light passed through and aligned perfectly with the window, painting a line on the floor directly in front of the altar. No one noticed, but the watcher saw. Perhaps they timed their visits precisely, moments when prayer, decision, and divine presence came together. What would you do with such a view? Witness the secretive hush of a conclave, the hush of bishops gathering before Mass, watchings of rituals, choices made in silence, decisions that shaped the course of history. We do not know who the watcher was. A trusted papal guardian? An observant monk? Maybe a secret society within the sacred walls, one tasked with ensuring no impure doctrine seeped into those frescoed heavens. Maybe no one remembers because records were intentionally purged. As modern restoration began in the 20th century, scanners detected that the wall behind the window was a single solid block, not accessible, not hollow. After decades of study, the Vatican sealed the slit, quietly, without explanation. In effect, they said, the Watcher's Window remains, but only as a relic. It begs questions. Was it ever used again? Is someone still appointed? Or is the Watcher gone, but the window left as a reminder? Late at night, if you're ever in the cloistered halls above the Sistine Chapel, listen closely. You can almost hear a breath, a faint presence, echoes of a person perched just above the masses, balancing solemn obligation in deep silence. In that narrow stone slit, someone witnessed faith in motion and never revealed it, and the Watcher's Window still dreams of who once looked through it. The bell that rang without sound. In a quiet corridor of the Vatican Museum, far from the main exhibits, rests a strange bronze bell darkened by time, its rim smooth, its surface barely catching the light. Most pass it without a second glance. No plaque tells its full story, just a small Latin inscription, and a date no one can confirm. But those who know, stop and stare. This is no ordinary bell. Its clapper is missing. No rope dangles. No mechanism invites ringing. And yet legend insists it used to toll, not by touch, not by hand, but during storms, without being struck. The story begins in the 1400s, when the bell was said to be recovered from the ruins of an ancient monastery near the northern edge of Rome. Monks there claimed it came from the east, possibly brought by travelers escaping persecution or seeking refuge from falling empires. The bell was forged from an unusual alloy, bronze, yes, but with trace elements rarely seen in bells of the era. Nickel, zinc, a mineral the monks simply referred to as the whisper metal. No one knew where it came from, but the bell had weight, presence, and something else. Monks who lived near it described hearing faint ringing in the middle of the night, not loud, just a shimmer in the air, like a chime from across a valley, but always before lightning, always before a storm. When wind shifted, when clouds gathered, the bell would ring without movement, without cause. They called it the storm warden. At first the sound was seen as divine warning, a gift, a signal, but as years passed it became something darker, because every time it rang something else happened too. Crops would wither, paintings would peel, walls would crack. A strange pressure filled the air when the bell chimed, like the monastery was holding its breath. Eventually the monks sealed it in a chamber underground, buried under prayer and stone, forgotten, until the Renaissance. A young Vatican historian named Matteo Carini, obsessed with unusual relics, stumbled across references to the buried bell. He followed whispers, copied cryptic diagrams from forgotten scrolls, and in 1534 convinced the church to retrieve it. His report says they dug through layers of rock, soot, and ancient ash. When they reached the bell, it was untouched. No rust, no dust. It sat as if waiting. Carini had it transported to the Vatican, carefully, silently. He wrote that on the night it arrived, Rome saw the longest thunderstorm in a decade. No lightning struck the city. No buildings were damaged. But the bell rang, just once. No one was near it. It simply hummed, and went still. Since then it has never rung again. But strange things follow it. The museum lights above it often flicker, though no faults are found. Visitors report a faint warmth when they pass, a low vibration. Some even claim they heard the echo of a chime, soft, sad, impossible. Modern scientists have examined the bell. They've run vibration tests, scanned the metal for signs of internal mechanisms. Nothing. Its body is dense, solid, and the clapper, gone, removed or perhaps never there. One researcher in the 1980s claimed the bell might operate on something called resonant frequency, that in the right pressure, the right atmosphere, even air could stir it into singing, but no one could replicate it. Others believe the bell doesn't respond to storms. It predicts them, feels them, a living barometer, an echo chamber of the Earth's breath. One theory even suggests it's not a bell at all, but a sensor, something ancient cultures built not to signal us, but to listen to thunder, to clouds, to tremors in the ground, a frequency translator for forces we've yet to understand. The Vatican, as always, has no comment. Today the bell sits behind thick glass, on a platform of black stone. Some nights the guards cover it, not because they're told to, but because they feel uneasy walking past it in silence. It doesn't move, it doesn't ring, but it feels, and in the heart of Rome where old gods and new saints share walls, the bell sleeps, waiting perhaps, for a storm worth remembering. The garden that shouldn't grow. There is a small courtyard within the walls of Vatican City that does not appear on most maps. No visitors are allowed inside. No photographs exist. Even the staff who work nearby don't speak of it often, only in passing, only in whispers. It's simply called the garden, but it is unlike any garden in Rome. Hidden between two older wings of the Apostolic Palace, near the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the secret archives, it occupies a narrow rectangular space, surrounded by walls that have stood for hundreds of years. The stones are thick, the doors are always locked, and yet within this stone trap something strange has taken root. From above, if you could ever see it, it looks impossibly green, thick vines climbing the limestone, flowers blooming year-round, and at the center, a tree, its branches twisted upward, its leaves deep emerald, almost blue in some light. The garden flourishes in all seasons. But here's what makes it mysterious. There are no visible water sources, no pipes, no irrigation lines, no rain reaches the courtyard, thanks to the steep rooftops around it. The space is always shaded. There is no soil trucked in, no sunlight for more than a few hours each day. And yet the garden grows, not just survives, thrives. No one remembers when it was first planted. The earliest known mention comes from a faded handwritten note in the Vatican's horticultural records, dated 6. The entry refers to a garden without irrigation, sustained by providence alone. Even then, the gardener writing it didn't claim credit. The note ends with a simple line: "It was already here." Throughout history, popes and scholars have taken interest in the garden quietly. Pope Pius X reportedly ordered the entire area sealed in 1852 after a group of French botanists requested to study it. They were denied access. One of them wrote in frustration, "A miracle of chlorophyll and secrecy, fed not by water, but by something else. What that something else is, no one can say." The plants that grow inside are not found in any botanical texts. Not exactly. They resemble familiar species: ivy, roses, cypress, but with differences. Petals that shimmer faintly in low light, leaves with too many veins. Some emit a scent that changes based on time of day. Visitors who have passed the garden gates claim it smells like citrus at sunrise, wet stone in the afternoon, and frankincense after dark. There are no insects in the garden, no birds, no bees, and yet the flowers bloom. At night, movement has been reported, not of animals but of caretakers, unseen hands. For centuries there have been rumors of a figure that tends the garden after sundown. Not a Vatican gardener, not clergy, just a silhouette, sometimes tall, sometimes small. No one ever gets a clear look. The security cameras facing that corridor are mysteriously non-functional between midnight and 4 a.m. every night, without fail. In 1963, an internal memo within the Vatican Security Office briefly acknowledged unauthorized activity near the garden gate. It was quickly classified and sealed. A visiting diplomat from Portugal, who glimpsed the garden while being escorted through a nearby hall, later wrote in his personal diary that the space felt older than the palace itself. He added, "I could not hear my footsteps there. The air did not move. The garden watched me." Others have described a feeling of calm, too calm, like the world goes quiet within those walls. No wind, no city sounds, just stillness, thick and perfect, like the space is out of time. The tree at the center, called L'Arbor Altum in one 18th century scroll, has been called many things over the centuries: the waiting tree, the first root, the breath of Eden. Some believe it is a descendant of a sacred tree described in lost Gnostic Gospels. Others suggest it was brought from the East during the Crusades, its seed hidden among relics. But the strangest account comes from a nun in 1904, Sister Caterina Bellani. She was allowed to enter the garden once, as part of a papal study. Her journal describes the experience in delicate handwriting. "The tree welcomed me. I do not know how I know this. It bent slightly as I approached, not from wind, but from knowing. I touched its bark. It was warm, not like sun-warmed stone, but like skin, and in the silence I heard something like breathing. Slow, deep, not mine." She never spoke of it again. After that visit, she left the convent without explanation and disappeared into seclusion for the rest of her life. There are theories, of course, that the garden was created by a forgotten saint, that it hides a buried relic, that it grows from soil carried from Mount Ararat or Mount Sinai. Some even believe the garden marks a celestial line, something aligned with ancient stars, like an earthly compass to a higher realm. But no one has found evidence, because no one is allowed inside. Today, only a select few have access. A single brass key is rumored to exist, passed quietly from one Vatican gardener to the next, and even they do not speak of what lies behind the walls, not publicly. It is not on the museum tours. It is not on official blueprints. But at dusk, if you walk past a certain stone corridor near the archives, you might feel the air change, slightly sweeter, slightly warmer, a smell like forgotten flowers, and in the silence that follows, you may feel it. The breath of something green, watching, growing, waiting. The crypt that changed its shape. There is a chamber beneath the Vatican, not the grand halls lit with marble and gold, not the rooms tourists are guided through. This place is older, quieter, and according to a 1702 map, it was shaped like a perfect cross. The sketch still exists, ink on rough parchment, faded brown with age, its lines carefully etched by a hand that took no shortcuts. 8 pillars drawn with precision, a central tomb shaded with slow strokes, notes in Latin scribbled at the margins. It was a crypt, documented, mapped, sealed away. The man who sketched it was a Vatican cartographer named Angelo Di Martino. He was tasked with surveying underground rooms after a partial collapse exposed a passage beneath the chapel of St. Lawrence. What he found, or thought he found, was an underground chamber shaped in a perfect cruciform, arms extending north, south, east, and west. Pillars lined the corridors. At the very center stood a tomb, surrounded by mosaics that, in his own words, did not match any known style of Christendom. And then, for 2 centuries, the records went silent. The drawing was filed, archived, and forgotten. Until 1893, when a small team of Vatican engineers, working on a restoration project, stumbled across the old records. Curious, they followed Martino's descriptions and found the entrance. The passage was still there, barely, but what waited at the end of it wasn't what Martino had drawn. Instead of a cruciform crypt with 8 pillars, they found a circular room with only 4. The tomb? Gone. The walls, bare. There were no mosaics, no inscriptions, just silence. Heavy, echoing silence. This is not a rumor, it's recorded in Vatican archival minutes from the 1893 project. The engineers were baffled. They checked the location, compared the drawings, even measured the walls. But there was no mistake. The room was in the right place, but it was the wrong room. Martino's 1702 drawing showed one reality. The 1893 records showed another. There are 3 common theories. The first is simple. Martino got it wrong. That in the flicker of torchlight and centuries-old dust, he saw a shape that wasn't there. That his mind, perhaps eager for symmetry and symbolism, filled in gaps. But there's a problem with that theory. Martino didn't work alone. His survey included measurements taken by 2 assistants, and their notes agree with his drawing. The second theory is darker. It claims the crypt was altered sometime between 1702 and 1893, that someone, perhaps even an order within the church, removed the tomb, filled the arms of the cross, and reshaped the chamber to match something else. But why? What was removed? And why no mention of such a major architectural project? The third theory is stranger. It suggests that the crypt shifted. There's a long-held belief among a few Vatican historians that the ground beneath the Apostolic Palace is not entirely stable, not geologically, but spatially. That there are rooms that appear and disappear, passages that open to nowhere, that the old catacombs don't just extend outward, but somehow inward, folding into spaces that don't always remain the same. Caretakers have spoken of stairs that once led to shrines, now ending in bare walls, of a staircase that spiraled downward one year, and the next was sealed in stone. These are just whispers, of course. Stories passed quietly between archivists who've worked in the Vatican's deeper levels for decades, but they sound eerily similar to what was discovered in the crypt. One modern-day researcher, who remains anonymous, was allowed to examine the chamber briefly in the early 2000s. He described it as cold, colder than the rest of the basement, he wrote, as if the room hadn't settled into the same time as the others. He noted that the walls were strangely smooth, lacking the chisel marks found elsewhere, and that when he whispered, the echo returned to him too fast, as if the room were smaller than it appeared. He wasn't permitted to return. Today that chamber is sealed again, access restricted. Not officially, of course. On paper, it's just part of the maintenance level, but guards are posted near its entrance. Visitors are not allowed past a certain point. The corridor that once led there is now bricked over, but the 1702 drawing still exists. It's kept in a glass case in the Vatican's map archive, seldom displayed. If you compare it side by side with the 1893 reconstruction, the 2 images seem to argue with each other. Same location, same depth, different reality. What happened in those 901 years? Was the tomb removed to hide something? Was the room transformed? Or did the crypt reshape itself? It's a question with no answer. The Vatican has thousands of rooms. Hundreds are undocumented, some sealed, some lost. Over time, doors have been locked, passageways filled, staircases erased. But what if not all of them are lost because of human hands? What if some of them are slipping, not forgotten but shifting, not removed but transformed? And what if that crypt, the one Martino so carefully measured, still exists, just not exactly where we think it does? Perhaps it's still there. Perhaps tonight the room is shaped like a circle, and next year, it may be something else entirely, something waiting to be found, or something that never left. The book that erased its own words. There is a book in the Vatican Library that does not behave like other books. It is not large. It is not gilded. Its pages are ordinary parchment, aged and yellowed, but what sets it apart is not what it contains. It's what it no longer does. For years it was shelved like countless others, just another line in the endless catalog of old manuscripts. A quiet presence, tucked between volumes on astronomy and prayer. And yet sometime in the late 1800s, a scholar made a note in the margins of a catalog record. Ink, fading, no one paid much attention. Fading ink was common in books that old, but something strange began to happen over the next few decades. Page by page, line by line, the words weren't just fading, they were vanishing. Not smudging, not worn away, gone. Entire sentences disappeared into the fibers of the parchment, like breath lost in fog. By the mid-20th century, half the book was unreadable. No one had touched it. No water damage, no mold, nothing explainable, just silence, replacing scripture, doctrine, letters that once guided beliefs, now left no trace. Some believed the ink had been made with unstable compounds, perhaps iron gall, a mix of tannins and iron salts, known to fade with time, yes, but not like this, because other books written with the same formula, same century, same script remained perfectly legible. A handful of scientists were allowed to examine the manuscript under UV and infrared light. What they found was unsettling. The ink hadn't merely disappeared. It had soaked so deep into the page that it was now part of the parchment itself, absorbed, digested, faded beyond the spectrum of visible light, almost as if the book had decided to swallow its own words. And then came the stranger part. In a digital scan made just 10 years ago, technicians noticed something that hadn't been seen before: tiny impressions, indentations left behind by the pressure of a quill. Even where ink had vanished, the ghost of the writing still remained in the texture of the paper. Every line, every sentence, the memory of meaning still pressed into the page. It was almost as if the book wanted to forget, but couldn't. When Vatican archivists attempted to transcribe it again, something odd happened. Their eyes began to play tricks. Lines they swore weren't visible suddenly appeared, then faded again. Words they were certain they'd just read were no longer there, and even stranger, some words seemed to change. A verse referencing a saint's teaching once spoke of discipline. Now in that same place, a different scholar saw disappearance. The same letters, but rearranged. No one could agree on what they were seeing anymore, so the book was quietly removed from public viewing. It now sits in a climate-controlled room, scanned, protected, and carefully watched. They no longer allow direct contact, no gloved hands, no turning of pages, not because it's too delicate, but because in some way the manuscript seems to be alive, responding, reacting, and every year one more sentence fades. Some call it a chemical anomaly. Others whisper of a manuscript never meant to be read forever, a book that held truths for a time and chose to let them go. Whatever it once said, whatever message it held for the world, it is now vanishing into itself. The Vatican never published a full transcription. They said the book could not be copied, not fully, not accurately. Too many words were missing, too many meanings lost in the soft breath of time. But still, late at night researchers say you can hold the scan up to the light, and if the room is dark enough, quiet enough, you'll see the faint lines reappear. Not clearly, not for long, just a shadow of meaning, as if the book even now is whispering one final thing: forget me. The choir who never left. It always begins the same way. A soft swell of voices, distant, almost indistinct, floating from somewhere deep inside the stone walls of the basilica. Gentle harmonies, layered tones, the sound of human voices rising and falling, in perfect unity. Tourists pause in the corridors, unsure at first. They glance upward. They listen. The sound feels sacred, yes, but also strangely misplaced, because there is no choir scheduled. Not that day, not that hour, not even in that part of the building. And yet the singing continues. Visitors to this centuries-old basilica, tucked quietly within the Vatican's older quarters, report hearing it most often near the apse. Others say it drifts from the older, closed-off sacristy hallways. A few swear it emerges from behind sealed wooden doors, down passageways that no longer connect to anything. Security guards have heard it too, and priests, and once even a choir director, who confirmed the notes were not random. They followed a pattern, a real piece of music, but not one anyone could identify. Not Gregorian, not polyphonic, something in between. It wasn't just a melody, it was structured, harmonized, but with phrasing unfamiliar to even the most well-read musicologists. Ancient sounding, yet not archived anywhere, as if it had been composed in a forgotten chapter of musical history, or never written down at all. In the 1990s, the phenomenon became more widely noticed. A researcher conducting an acoustic study recorded ambient tones in the rear chapel. On playback, the faint sound of voices could be heard in the background. He returned again at night. More microphones, more silence, but again, voices. Female sopranos, male tenors, children's voices too. He was alone. He checked the corridors. Nothing. He contacted the basilica staff. No rehearsals, no ambient speakers, no music of any kind had been piped in, and yet he left with over 7 hours of recordings. When played back through spectral analysis software, something even stranger happened. Some of the voices weren't layered at all. They were staggered, like echoes repeating across time. The same refrain sung multiple times, but from different corners of the structure, as though the sound were folding in on itself. Different versions of the same moment, drifting across years, singing in perfect sync, a sound imprint. One Vatican archivist proposed the theory that the basilica's unique construction created a kind of acoustic memory, a place so saturated with sacred music over the centuries that the stone itself retained traces of it, replaying them like faint echoes. But others disagreed, because new patterns of music were still emerging, new arrangements that no living composer had written, and in one unsettling case, a scholar reported hearing the chant form her own name, just once, only a whisper, but unmistakable. The audio recordings were later examined by experts in Germany. They confirmed the harmonics were real, not hallucinations, not imagination. There was measurable audio data, but they couldn't isolate a source. No speakers, no electronics, no airflow that could create the phenomenon. And so the legend began to grow, that within the old stones of this basilica, a choir still lingered, not of the living, not entirely of the dead, but something in between. The choir who never left. Older priests speak of it gently, as if remembering an old friend. They say it began centuries ago. A group of singers who were buried nearby, their final wish, to be allowed to sing in the house of God for eternity. And perhaps they do. Every now and then a tourist will stop mid-step, turning toward a hallway that leads nowhere, their eyes unfocused, their ears straining. They swear they hear it. A tone, a voice, a line of harmony that threads through the air like incense. They look around. They call out. They find no one. But in the silence that follows, comes a soft final note, a cadence, a gentle end, as if the singers, having been heard once more, are content to fade again, and the basilica returns to stillness, but not emptiness, never emptiness, because somewhere behind the stone, somewhere down the ancient halls where light no longer reaches, the choir continues to sing, and if you listen long enough, if your heart is quiet enough, you might hear them call your name too. The cross that was buried twice. It was meant to be the most sacred of all relics, a fragment of the very cross on which Christ was crucified, preserved for centuries, guarded by kings, fought over by empires, and then lost. But unlike other relics, this one did not vanish into myth. It disappeared, was rediscovered, then disappeared again, intentionally, buried not once, but twice, and no one seems to know why. The first record of the relic dates back to the 4th century, when Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, embarked on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. According to early Christian chroniclers, she discovered 3 wooden crosses buried beneath a ruined Roman temple in Jerusalem. One of them, she believed, was the true cross. Pieces of that relic were distributed across the Christian world. Constantinople, Rome, Antioch, and other cities built chapels and reliquaries to house their fragments, but one portion was different, larger, intact, encased in gold and crystal. It was kept in a marble vault beneath a monastery in northern Anatolia. The records say it was only brought out during plagues or wars, times when the world teetered on the edge of collapse. Then came the 13th century. During a period of conflict between Crusaders and Byzantine loyalists, the monastery was attacked, the vault was breached, and the relic vanished. For over 400 years there were no reliable sightings, until 1697. A Jesuit scholar named Matthias Gravelet wrote in his private journals that he had seen a cross of ancient timber, adorned with fittings not of this age, sealed beneath glass, and hidden in a hollowed stone under the altar of a minor church in Lyon. He included a sketch, measurements, even a coded note, hidden within a psalm, suggesting that the cross had been reburied, quietly, deliberately. He did not say who buried it, or why. Years later, in the early 1800s, a small chapel on the outskirts of Lyon was scheduled for demolition. Inside its foundation, workers found a stone cavity. Inside, wrapped in decaying red cloth and tucked in a silver reliquary, was a cross. It matched Gravelet's description exactly. But here's where the mystery deepens. The find was not announced. No ceremony, no relic procession, no church proclamation. Instead, a local bishop quietly ordered the cross to be moved. It was taken to an abbey 200 kilometers away, under armed guard, and sealed in a chamber beneath the apse. A new altar was built on top. No plaques, no markers. It was buried again, on purpose. Modern researchers who have traced the relic's path agree that it was once revered, even fought over. But today, few in the church speak of it at all. When asked, Vatican archivists deflect. There are many relics, they say. Not all are catalogued, but there is one internal memo, leaked in the 1970s, that seems to suggest concern. Translated from Latin, it reads, Ord fast. The object must not be venerated at present. Let it rest beneath the stone. There are reasons the faithful must not know. No further explanation was ever provided. A theory emerged, that the cross fragment may not be what it seems. One historian proposed that the wood bore unusual carvings, symbols not consistent with early Christian iconography. Another whispered that beneath the golden clasps was a faint stain that never faded. Not blood exactly, something older. One record, never confirmed, claims a priest who handled the relic later suffered vivid visions and had to be removed from service. Another says the wood emitted a scent not like cedar or pine, but something bitter, like burning resin, or charred incense. And then there's the story of the second burial. A monk, long retired, claimed to have witnessed it as a young novice. He said the bishop who received the cross in the 1800s wept upon seeing it, not from awe, but from fear. He gathered the elder priests. There was a mass held behind closed doors. Then the relic was lowered into the earth again. No relic is buried like that unless someone wanted it to stay lost. But why? Some say it was cursed. Others believe it was too powerful, too real, that if the faithful saw it, touched it, the world would never be the same. There's also a rumor that it was shown once more during the Second World War, hidden in a private chamber as bombs fell around the monastery, that a few monks prayed before it, and the monastery was spared. No records confirm this, and yet the abbey still stands. The chamber is still sealed, and no one speaks of what lies beneath. Today the relic is technically unlisted. The church will not confirm its location, and no official pilgrimage is permitted. But some still visit the abbey. They sit near the old apse, and they say that if you wait long enough in the silence, you feel something. Not warmth, not peace. Something heavy, as if the stone beneath your feet is holding more than just relics, as if the weight of something ancient is waiting, not to be found again, but to remain hidden, buried, twice, and maybe that's where it should stay. The Vault of Vanished Saints. Some rooms are empty because they were never meant to hold anything. Others are empty because something once was there, and now it's gone. In the deeper corners of Vatican archives and reliquary chambers, there's a quiet shelf of marble drawers. Each drawer bears a name, carved in Latin, worn by time, but still readable. Each one labeled not just with a name, but a story, a martyr, a saint. Someone once venerated, cherished, recorded by hand, and yet when opened, the drawers hold nothing. Not bone, not cloth, not dust, just silence. This is not a single drawer misfiled. It's not an accident of cataloging. There are dozens of these, enough that one archivist, long retired now, whispered about it in a single footnote no one was meant to find. He wrote, "They are saints without presence, names without weight, gone but accounted for." His note wasn't in a journal or a report. It was scribbled on the back of an inventory card from the 1930s. It was found years later, tucked into a book that had nothing to do with relics. When you walk into the relic vault, you expect quiet, but not this kind. The air is still, the temperature controlled. Lights hum, low and dim. You see golden cases housing finger bones, ivory boxes with slivers of wood said to be from the true cross. You expect reverence, dustless care, a kind of sacred museum. But off in one corner are the drawers that no one talks about anymore, each the size of a shoebox. Some smaller, some larger, all labeled, all empty. Saint Aurelius, gone. Saint Belina, gone. Saint Marcus of the Old Way, gone. Not missing, not misfiled, gone. Old records suggest they were moved once during a renovation in the 18th century, but the records of where they were relocated end abruptly. One line of ink trails off the page. No follow-up, no confirmation. Some drawers have small papers inside, fragments of earlier tags, Latin notes that once listed contents. One reads caput in argento, a head once sealed in silver. The head is gone. The silver, gone. Even the wax seal that once marked the box, gone. In 1967, an unofficial review of the relic room was conducted by a young seminarian with a passion for church history. He didn't last long in the order, but he kept notes. One entry simply reads, "I do not understand how so many saints can vanish, and no one speaks of it." He never published his findings. He never appeared in any official report. But the box that held his notes, eventually donated to a university, contained a small sketch, a diagram of the drawers, 48 in total. He highlighted 31 as unaccounted for. A century earlier, in 1854, a traveler from France wrote about seeing relics during a private Vatican tour. His journal mentioned a strange drawer, marked with a martyr's name, but filled only with dry rose petals. That journal was never published. It sat in a Paris attic for 90 years before being rediscovered. No one knows if he made it up or saw something real. But here's where it grows stranger. Some of the saints listed on these drawers no longer appear in the official canon. It's as if their stories were erased alongside their remains. Names once inscribed in gold now barely exist in any modern litany. It raises questions. Were these saints real? Were their relics ever actually here? Or did the church quietly, over time, erase their presence? The window that sees the moon. There is a quiet place high in the architecture of the Apostolic Palace. Few ever climb the stairs to reach it. It isn't on the tour maps. There are no signs, no velvet ropes, no crowds with cameras. It exists mostly in silence, at the end of a narrow corridor where the air feels different, older, somehow, and undisturbed. It's not a chapel, not a study, not a storeroom, just a room, circular, modest and plain. Its only feature is a round window. Not large, not decorative, not made of stained glass, just a circle of stone with a hollowed center, cut through centuries ago, for reasons that no records clearly explain. During the day, the light streams in, golden and soft. Dust dances through the beam like tiny stars. But most of the year, this room remains unvisited, empty, unremarkable, until one night, only one night, when something unusual happens. The Vatican has weathered centuries of renovations, earthquakes, restorations, but somehow this window never moved. The stones around it shifted, walls were patched and painted, but this one circle, this one cold, unpolished window, remained in exactly the same place. And every year, on the night of the winter solstice, it captures the moon. Not just a glimpse, not a passing glow, it locks in with perfect alignment. The moon rests directly in the center of the circle, and for a few hours the room is filled with silver light, like it was waiting all year for this one moment. Historians debate whether it was intentional. Astronomers have tried to chart the alignment. Architects have measured angles and elevations. But there are no records. No architectural drawings from the era mention this window. There's no dedication plaque, no celestial reference, nothing to say whether it was by design or by chance. And yet it happens. Every year, without fail. One theory suggests that this room may have been a place of silent reflection, a monk's solitary cell, perhaps a scholar who studied both scripture and stars. In the Renaissance era, the church was more entangled with astronomy than we remember. The calendar we use today, the Gregorian calendar, was born from the Vatican's desire to align with the heavens more precisely. Perhaps someone, centuries ago, carved that window to mark time in a different way, not by clock or candle, but by moonlight. Locals whisper other theories. Some say the window was used for secret observations, that it was a tool in some lost lunar calendar known only to a select few. Others believe the room was part of an ancient ritual forgotten now but kept alive through architecture. The alignment of the moon, they say, signaled something, a beginning, or maybe an end. And there are older whispers still. Some custodians speak of a strange stillness that settles in the room on that night, that when the moon appears in full focus through the stone circle, time seems to slow, sound becomes muffled, the heartbeat softens. They say shadows retreat to the walls, and the light is not just cold but intelligent, like being watched by something serene but immeasurable. Of course, there is no proof, no photos, no scientific studies published on this room. The Vatican archives are silent on the matter, and those who've stood there during that silver moment tend not to speak much of it afterward. Just a nod, a look in the eyes, a kind of quiet agreement that some things are better left unnamed. One letter, however, did survive, dated 1891, written by a German priest visiting the Vatican for a winter retreat. He mentions being guided to the lunar room by a quiet brother who said nothing during the walk, only that he must see it before midnight. The priest writes, "I stood in that circle of light and felt, not warmth but welcome, not understanding but peace. It was like the world turned inside out for a moment, and something ancient looked in from the other side." That letter was never mailed. It was found tucked inside the back of a prayer book, left in a pew years later. There are hundreds of rooms inside Vatican City, some grand, some hidden, some filled with art, others with dust, but few are like this. A room that seems to have no function, no glory, just one perfect purpose, played out once a year, to frame the moon, to witness it, and then to wait. And in that waiting, there's something oddly comforting, a kind of faith that doesn't need words or hymns, just the simple belief that even in stone and silence, the universe finds its way in. Perhaps we need more places like that, rooms not designed for power or spectacle, but for stillness. Rooms that don't demand answers, but invite quiet questions. What else might we see, if we simply stood still and let the moon rise? So if you ever find yourself wandering unfamiliar corridors, in an old place where time moves differently, and the air feels like memory, look for the circular window. It may not seem like much, but on one night, in the hush of winter, it opens, not to the world outside, but to the rhythm of something greater, something that's been watching, quietly, all along. And when it does, let it find you. The mask in the marble. There's a column near the edge of one of the less traveled corridors in the Vatican. It's not especially grand, not one of the ones flanked by gold or ringed in candlelight. In fact, most visitors never notice it at all. But if you stop there quietly, slowly, maybe late in the afternoon when the light spills just right, you might see something, a face, half smiling, faintly carved into the marble, almost as if it's trying to stay hidden. It's not a cherub, not a saint, not a known figure from scripture or history. The Vatican archivists don't even have a record of its creation. It's not listed in the official stonework documents. No artist ever signed it. No restoration log mentions touching it. It's just there, waiting. Some people pass it entirely, their eyes too distracted by the stained glass overhead. But for those who pause, there's an odd stillness, as if the air around it becomes denser, as if the face knows you're looking at it. The curl of the lip, the depth of the eye sockets. They're far too human to be an accident, but not quite lifelike enough to be comforting. The corridor itself isn't part of the usual tours. It's tucked behind a chapel, and you have to know which door to gently lean open, which hallway to step into. And once you're there, it's quiet. So quiet that even your breath seems to echo a little louder than it should. The first known mention of the face wasn't in a Vatican document. It was in a letter written by a monk in the late 1500s. He describes a marble trickster watching from the shadows, and how he felt its gaze linger on him long after he'd walked away. The letter wasn't meant for the public. It was written to a brother at another monastery. A personal note, private, but somehow it survived, preserved in a private library, rediscovered in the 19th century. What's curious is that in later photos of that same column, some taken for architectural surveys in the 1800s, the face doesn't appear, not clearly. The marble looks smooth, almost untouched, but in modern images, the face is there again, as though it returned. Or maybe, it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Art historians have debated the carving's origin for years. Some say it's an unfinished work, an apprentice sculptor practicing a human figure before chiseling it away. Others insist it's a deliberate addition by a Vatican mason, left behind like a signature in code. And a few, those less eager to speak aloud, whisper that it wasn't made by any human hand at all. There's a theory, passed in quiet circles, that the face doesn't stay still, that if you were to photograph it every year, something would shift, just slightly. The angle of the eyes, the tilt of the chin, the curve of the mouth, always subtle, always deniable, but just enough to leave you wondering, did it look like this before, or did it change just for you? One Vatican guard, who worked the halls for over 30 years, said he never liked walking past that column at night, not because he feared it, but because he always felt watched, not by something malevolent, just aware, as if the stone face had eyes on the inside, as if it remembered every visitor who paused there and kept their gaze in return. And then there's the matter of its placement. The column isn't load-bearing, it's decorative, but that exact corner of the corridor, where the face is located, aligns with an ancient Roman road buried far below. Engineers discovered it during a renovation, but chose to leave it undisturbed. That road once led toward a pagan temple, long since erased. Could the marble used for that column have come from there? A few researchers believe so, and if that's true, the face might not be Christian at all. It might be older, much older, a relic of something long forgotten, carved into the stone when gods had different names and temples stood where chapels now rise. But this is just speculation. The Vatican doesn't officially recognize the face. No placards mark its presence. No audio guide mentions it. It remains in silence, in shadow. Visitors who do see it tend to say the same thing, that it feels familiar, that there's something in the expression, something deeply human, a kind of timeless mischief, or melancholy, like a memory you can't place, or a dream that lingers hours after waking. One woman, a historian from Florence, once spent an entire afternoon standing across from it, just watching. She later wrote in her notes that it reminded her of someone, but she couldn't figure out who. It is not a man, she said, but the memory of one. No one knows who carved it, no one knows why, but there it remains, a face in marble, half hidden, half smiling, watching every soul who dares to look a little too long. And maybe that's its purpose, not to be explained, but to be noticed, just once, then remembered, not like a statue or a monument, but like a presence, one that chooses to be seen only by those willing to stop and truly see. So if you ever find yourself in that quiet corridor, if your feet guide you there by chance or instinct, pause, let your eyes adjust, let your breath slow, and look, the face is there, waiting in the marble, and it has been for a very, very long time. The page that was never written. The scroll is brittle now, kept behind a glass case under soft museum light. It barely resembles the powerful message it was once intended to carry. A parchment from the late 4th century, found deep in the Vatican Library's hidden shelves. The ink has held, the edges have frayed, but what truly catches the eye isn't what is written, it's what isn't. Roughly 2/3 through the document, after a series of prophetic lines forecasting strange astronomical events, descriptions of darkened suns, and kingdoms that rise and fall without war, the text simply stops. Mid-sentence. A long dash, then nothing, and for nearly 1,000 years people have been asking the same thing. Why? It's not a smudge, not an error. The parchment itself is clean, almost too clean in that spot, like it was always meant to be left open, unfinished. It was written in Greek, mostly though not classical, a later script probably written by a scribe of mixed training, someone blending old forms with newer post-Byzantine flourishes. This wasn't a common scroll, it was likely copied from something older and intended to preserve knowledge, not create it. But someone somewhere stopped. Scholars have theories. Maybe the scribe ran out of ink. Maybe the candle died. Maybe he fell asleep, never to wake again. But if that were true, why wasn't the scroll ever resumed? In the margins, you can see tiny dots, faint pinpricks left by the person who was ruling the parchment. A guide to keep the lines straight. Even those dots stop abruptly, almost like the person marking them down just lifted their hand and walked away. The prophecy itself is strange. It doesn't mention specific kings or kingdoms, but rather a cold voice from the east, and a great silence that speaks through mirrors, odd phrases, symbolic, unclear. Then in the very last line before the missing portion, it says something strange, and the watcher shall rise when, and that's it. no punctuation, no period, just that word when, followed by a wide blank space that no one has ever been able to explain. It's not torn, not scraped. There's no evidence of removal. The ink doesn't trail off. It simply ends. Librarians from every century have catalogued the scroll and puzzled over it. Some say the missing line was intentional, a warning, a signal, that when the watcher returns, the final words will reveal themselves. Others think it was a mistake, one that became sacred simply because time gave it meaning. But perhaps most haunting of all is this: a 15th century monk who copied part of the scroll into his private notebook added something curious in the margin beside that same broken sentence. In tiny Latin, barely visible, he wrote, he feared what it would say. Who he is, no one knows. The monk? The original scribe? Or perhaps the person who gave the prophecy in the first place? No continuation of the scroll has ever been found. No matching copies, no second volume, just one lonely parchment, with a sentence that breaks the silence like a whisper through time. Visitors to the exhibit today often lean in close to the glass, reading the words aloud, then waiting, just for a moment, as if the missing line might suddenly appear if spoken gently enough. But it never does. The page that was never written remains just that, a void in the message, a silence in the prophecy, a story waiting for its last breath. The staircase to nowhere. There are staircases all throughout the Vatican, grand ones that sweep upward into marble halls, narrow ones meant only for servants and scribes, and spiral staircases so tight and steep you have to hold both sides of the wall to keep your balance. But there's one that doesn't lead anywhere at all. It's not on the public maps. You won't find it in the architectural blueprints. Even the staff who know the archives best don't like to talk about it. But it's there, beneath the Vatican's oldest records room, down a corridor of forgotten shelves and sealed cases, past a metal door that rarely opens. The doorway is unmarked. It looks like a closet at first, just a slab of wood, darkened with age, slightly bowed. But open it and you'll see the first few steps, made of old stone, hand-chiseled, rounded in the center, as if worn down by centuries of cautious feet. There are no lights, no signs, just a circular stair, spiraling tightly down into the shadows. For years it was assumed the staircase was part of a collapsed cellar, some forgotten access tunnel or maintenance shaft. That is, until someone followed it to the bottom. A junior archivist, barely in his 20s, was sent to inventory the back hall storage during a summer renovation. Curious, he stepped into the stairwell with only a flashlight and his notebook. He descended for nearly 2 minutes, down and down, 50, 60, maybe more than 100 steps. He said the walls felt older than the building around them. The mortar between the stones was loose in places, crumbling like dry powder. Then it ended. Not in a door, not in a room, but in a wall. A perfectly flat, featureless wall. Just stone, seamless, cold to the touch. No crack where it met the last step. No hinge, no handle. As if the staircase had once continued, but was deliberately sealed, buried alive beneath centuries of silence. The archivist knocked, listened. There was nothing on the other side. He tried to measure the acoustics. He said it didn't echo the way stone normally does. The sound stopped short, like the wall was absorbing it. When he returned upstairs and told his supervisor, he was told quietly not to go back. That part of the archive was under review, being evaluated. No reason was given. But later in the break room, a senior staffer pulled him aside. She'd worked in the archives for over 30 years, and she said the staircase had been found before, twice. Once in the 1930s, when a maintenance worker went missing for several hours, and later turned up disoriented, rambling about a hallway with no doors. And once again in the late 1970s, when a Jesuit historian marked it as a possible access point to a buried Roman structure, then abruptly closed the file. No one has officially documented the staircase since. There are no public photographs, no excavation notes. It doesn't appear on emergency schematics, and yet it's there, still, waiting. Some believe it leads to a lost room, once sealed for security or sanctity. Others whisper it was never a room at all, but a passage, meant to be forgotten. There's a story, though no one knows its origin, about a scroll found in a separate archive, unrelated, that described a stair that turns away from light, into silence, into the unreturning path. The phrasing is poetic, vague, but unsettling. Tourists will never see it. Most Vatican employees never hear of it. But those who work late in that part of the building, especially when the floors creak and the night feels heavier than it should, they sometimes pause near that old wooden door and wonder, why build a staircase that ends in stone? Why leave it so intact? And what, if anything, might be listening on the other side of that wall? The priest who disappeared twice. In the quiet margins of church history, where stories fade into footnotes and names blur into ledgers, there lived a man named Father Matteo Ricci, not to be confused with the famed Jesuit missionary of the 1600s, but a lesser-known namesake, born in the early 1800s in a hillside town outside Perugia. He was a scholar by temperament, not a preacher. Bookish, soft-spoken, unassuming. By all accounts he was a man more interested in ink and parchment than pulpit and politics. He entered the priesthood early, but rather than take on a parish, he was assigned to the Vatican's auxiliary libraries in 1836, where he was tasked with helping to catalog and annotate obscure theological texts, many of them centuries old, written in fading Latin or older Greek. Colleagues said he had a gift for pattern recognition. He'd find subtle references that others missed, links between apocryphal letters and forgotten sermons. He quietly earned a reputation as someone who saw meaning in dust. But in the spring of 1841, Father Ricoy failed to report to work. At first nothing seemed unusual. Illness was common. Delays happened. But by the second day, concern grew. By the third, his room was checked. It was undisturbed, his bed made, his books neatly stacked, his robes folded over the back of the chair. There were no signs of travel, no letter of leave, no indication of distress. He had simply vanished. A Vatican inquiry was launched. The local authorities searched the surrounding districts. Priests and guards questioned travelers, beggars, monks, but nothing turned up. He was gone without trace, without reason. The only strange clue came from a janitor working in the lower archive halls. He reported hearing footsteps descending a stairwell late that night, the kind of slow, careful steps someone makes when carrying something heavy. But no one else had been scheduled in the building, and the stairwell in question led to a locked storage vault, unopened for years. The report was noted, then forgotten. Father Ricci was quietly marked as missing, and presumed dead. A funeral mass was held in absentia. His belongings were boxed and shelved. The church moved on. But the story doesn't end there. 50 years later, in 1891, a renovation project was underway in one of the smaller side chapels near the Vatican's eastern boundary. As workers peeled back old plaster and lifted warped floorboards, they uncovered a compartment behind the altar wall. Inside was a bundle of cloth, carefully wrapped and sealed with a wax emblem. The seal was faded but bore the unmistakable mark of the pontifical archives. Inside the bundle was a journal. The first few pages were missing, but the handwriting matched other documents by Father Ricci. The journal was his, and it was dated 1843, 2 full years after he had disappeared. That alone would have made the discovery remarkable. But what the journal contained was stranger still. It wasn't a diary of events. Not exactly. The entries were fragmented. Some pages filled with diagrams, floor plans, symbols, long strings of numbers. Others were theological musings, written in a tone far more urgent than anything in his earlier work. There were repeated references to the second threshold, to the door beneath the chapel that was not built but found. He wrote of a chamber with no holy name, but something older. He described a presence watching between hours, and made cryptic notes about voices that speak only through silence. Even more unsettling, several entries describe dreams, vivid ones, of hallways that shifted, of staircases that bent backward, of a library without walls. The final pages were written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The last full sentence, scrawled in shaky ink, read, "I was not meant to return. The gate has memory. It opened once, and now it knows me." No body was ever found. No explanation for where Ricci had been, or how his journal came to be hidden behind the chapel wall, was ever given. Some suggested he had suffered a breakdown, that he wandered, hid, perhaps even returned quietly to Rome before vanishing again. Others believed he had discovered something that pulled him deeper than the world allowed. The journal was archived, quietly. It's not displayed. Few even know it exists. But occasionally, when scholars request certain old manuscripts from the 1840s, they're directed by accident or design to Box 7213A. And inside, tucked behind dull correspondence and liturgical inventories, they find it. The journal of a man who disappeared twice, and each time it's found again, the same questions rise, unanswered. Where did Father Ricci go? What did he find? And why did he return only long enough to leave a warning no one could fully read, until it was far too late? The ceiling that whispers back. There is a place in the Vatican that few ever notice. A modest dome, not the grand one above the basilica, but smaller, quieter, nestled deeper in the Vatican's complex layout. Those who walk beneath it often pass without thought, but some stop. They pause, and they listen. Because under that dome, sound behaves differently. Whispers carry in strange ways. Murmurs reach ears they weren't meant for. Some have said they hear their own words return to them, reshaped. Others claim they hear someone else entirely. A voice, familiar, unmistakable. This isn't fiction. Acoustic engineers have tested it. Under that particular dome, if you stand in just the right spot, your voice will travel in curved paths, bouncing softly from surface to surface, circling back to you, but not as it was. Sometimes it returns slower, sometimes higher. Visitors who've stood beneath that ceiling describe a feeling of sudden silence, like stepping into a bubble. No wind, no city sounds, just the breath of the building itself. And in that stillness, whispers begin. Old records, unofficial ones, note this spot as early as the 1700s. A small mention in a letter from a papal aide. He called it La Cupola que Susurra, the dome that whispers. He claimed he'd gone there to pray, that as he sat in quiet reflection, he heard someone behind him, a voice he hadn't heard in years, his mother's, whispering the prayer she used to say when he was young. He ran. The dome was empty. He never returned. There are strange markings on the underside of that ceiling. Faint, faded. They don't match the artistic style of any other chamber nearby. Almost geometric, a pattern that seems to spiral, like a map of airflow, or a net meant to catch sound. And then there's the odd fact that no blueprints exist for how this dome was constructed. Not in the Vatican's architectural records. Not in papal restoration logs. Not in any of the known construction phases. It's as if it simply was always there. Yet it clearly wasn't. Photographs from before the 1600s show a different ceiling in that area. Flat, painted, plain. But after a fire, one with no known source, the roof was rebuilt. Or perhaps replaced. The details are hazy. Vatican archivists acknowledge this blank spot in the timeline, but no documents explain it. One theory suggests a visiting mathematician, someone connected to the Medici family, was allowed a private commission to study sound in the Vatican's chambers, but his name, if he existed, is never listed. And the design of the dome is oddly perfect, almost too perfect. Modern architects studying the geometry of the chamber find it difficult to replicate. The way sound refracts inside is like what you'd expect in a modern audio lab, not a Renaissance chapel. Some call it a miracle. Others believe it's the leftover result of an experiment, a sonic tool once used to monitor speech without being seen, like a whispering gallery, only far more focused. There are even unconfirmed reports of the Pope at the time ordering it sealed off for over a decade. No explanation was given. When it reopened, the whispers continued. Tour guides never bring groups to this place. It's too inconsistent. Sometimes it's quiet, empty, still, and other times, a single person under the dome hears what they swear is someone speaking just over their shoulder. A voice, clear, gentle. But the moment they turn, the room is silent. It's become something of a quiet rumor among the staff. Maintenance workers pass the story along with a shrug. If you hear your own thoughts answered, they say, don't speak back. Some brave or curious visitors record their experiences. A whisper that completes their sentence. A voice that repeats their name. One tourist, shaken, claimed she asked a question aloud under the dome about her childhood, and the answer came back, in a voice she recognized as her grandmother's. She fainted. Security helped her out, but she refused to speak about it again. And yet, others say nothing happens at all. They stand, they listen, they hear nothing. Maybe the whispers only come to those who are truly still, or truly alone, or maybe the dome chooses who it answers. Late-night workers avoid walking beneath it, just in case. And if you ever find yourself in the Vatican, and you happen to step into a room with a dome that doesn't look like much, and the floor suddenly feels a little too quiet, listen closely. If your thoughts echo back at you, softly, differently, don't be afraid, but don't reply. The ink that bled through time. In the archives of a quiet European monastery, deep inside a sealed folio of 17th century estate records, something impossible was found. It wasn't gold, or a relic, or even a secret map. It was ink. Ink that didn't belong, ink that shouldn't have been there. The page was routine, a record of land transfers from the year 1683. Dull handwriting. Brown faded, nothing unusual. But on the reverse side, faint, almost ghostly, were the remnants of a completely different letter. A personal letter. Signed. Dated. From the year 1510. The ink had bled through, but not from the same page. Not even from the same document. And not from the same time. This wasn't ordinary bleed-through caused by age or pressure. The original page the 1510 letter was written on was gone, never found. The paper that now held its shadow had been written more than 170 years later. The two sheets had never touched, they'd never been stored together. And yet, the words were clear. Backwards, yes. Faint, but undeniably there, and undeniably old. Archivists were stunned. They tested the ink. It matched iron gall ink, common in the early 1500s, corrosive, distinctive, but the parchment it had soaked into, from a later century, using a different pulp, treated with a different finish. The two shouldn't have interacted, not across time, but they had, and the content of the letter only deepened the mystery. It wasn't political or religious, it was personal. A short note between two men, one a printer, the other a philosopher, discussing a book that had not yet been written, a book whose title would only appear for the first time in 1532. a book lost to history, until now. Some believed the ink had ghosted through layers during some restoration, that wetness or humidity caused a transference. But the monastery's climate control was flawless. The records were stored in sealed conditions since the 1800s, no water damage, no warping, and no other examples of ink drift like this in any of the thousands of books in the vault. Only this one page, only this one letter. Experts tried to trace the sender. His name was Pietro, a printer from Florence, but no records matched. The handwriting, however, bore eerie similarities to marginal notes in several known books of the period, the kind of notes no one ever reads, until someone did. A researcher noticed that the handwriting from the phantom letter also appeared, quietly across the margins of 3 books printed decades apart, all anonymously, all underlined in the same fashion, the same looping lowercase g, the same long tail s. It was him. Whoever Pietro was, he had left a trail in ink, but over centuries, as if his words kept finding a way through. Some now wonder if the letter was meant to be found, that maybe this transfer wasn't accidental, that somehow, in some unknown way, certain thoughts written with enough intention, enough purpose can echo forward, can bleed through, like ink through paper, but across time itself. And then there's the final line of the letter, almost an afterthought. We will not meet again, but they will find us if we write enough. Signed with a single letter. P. Was it superstition? Was it coincidence? Or was it something else? When the document was placed under ultraviolet light, another surprise appeared. Around the phantom words were loops of symbols, faint circular patterns in the fibers of the paper itself. Not ink, not visible to the naked eye, pressed, like someone had stamped the page from the other side of history. No one knows what they mean. They've never appeared in any other document from the archive, or anywhere else, and no other ghost letter has been found since. But the page still exists, still held in a sealed case, and if you visit the monastery and look close enough, you'll see the words, as if the past is still trying to speak, as if the ink hasn't finished bleeding through time. The candle that wouldn't burn out. Inside the Vatican archives, where light is limited and silence is sacred, there once stood a small brass pedestal, plain, unmarked, and almost always overlooked. Atop it sat a single white candle, not tall, not gilded, just ordinary looking, except for one thing. It never went out. The first time someone noticed was in 1928. A cleric tasked with monitoring humidity and pests in the sealed vaults reported a strange warmth coming from a corner of the chamber marked Tessera Section 4. When he investigated, he found a candle burning. There was no soot, no melted wax, no evidence of matches or flame, but the wick glowed, steady and soft. Thinking it a mistake, he snuffed it out with his fingers. The next day, it was burning again. At first, officials believed it was a trick. Some thought it was one of the maintenance monks using old chemical mixtures for ceremonial purposes. Others suspected phosphorus or camphor, something alchemical, something left behind from a different era. But when they examined the candle closely, they found it wasn't made of wax at all. It wasn't tallow, or beeswax, or paraffin. It was something else. A soft, pale substance that felt like wax, but didn't melt like it. Under magnification, the surface shimmered faintly, like it had layers. Layers or memory. They left it alone, and it continued to burn for weeks, then months, then years, 12 years, always the same glow. Not too bright, not hot, just gently flickering. Monks began referring to it as lux memoriam, the memory light. No one touched it anymore, but records began to collect around it. Scrolls that had once been lost were mysteriously returned and stacked beneath it. Books misfiled decades earlier were somehow placed beside it, as if it were organizing, watching, waiting, and always burning. The candle's location was discreet. Only 3 people had official access to the chamber, but whispers began to circulate. That prayers spoken near the flame seemed to be remembered. That one man who had gone blind could still see the flicker when he passed by. That the flame reacted when lies were spoken. In 1940, amid growing tensions in Europe and the expansion of the Second World War, strange phenomena were noted. The candle's flame flared when bombs fell in Rome. It sputtered when key Vatican officials died. And on the night of an attempted theft in the archives, it burned blue. Witnesses described the glow as unnatural, cold but sharp, as if the candle had become aware. Then, just after midnight one winter morning in 1941, the Pope himself, Pius XII, entered the chamber. No attendants, no note of why. He approached the candle, and without speaking, extinguished it, not with water, not with breath. He placed a bare hand over the flame, and it vanished. When asked about the incident, he gave only a single sentence: "Some fires are not meant to be studied, only respected." The candle was never seen again, its pedestal removed, its chamber sealed, and the only record left is a quiet note in the margin of an unrelated volume. The memory of flame is heavier than light. No name, no date, but the handwriting matches the man who first found it. And in the quietest moments of the archive, even now, some archivists say they can feel warmth just before turning a corner, like a breath of heat, where there is no fire, no light, only memory. The saint. They tried to forget. In the quiet corners of sacred history, there are names that echo for centuries, and names that vanish, as if erased by time itself. But what happens when a name is erased, and the statue remains? Tucked behind the northern colonnade of a minor chapel inside the Vatican, unmarked, overshadowed and rarely photographed, stands a statue with no plaque, a figure carved in white marble, hands folded, eyes closed, not a saint you'd recognize, and yet, undeniably once revered. For centuries, pilgrims passed this statue in silence. No one spoke of it, no tour guides mentioned it, and when researchers tried to identify it in old records, they found something chilling. This saint's name had been carefully, intentionally removed from every liturgical text after the year 1714. No feast day, no mention in sermons, no inclusion in prayer, and yet their statue still stood, not in a museum, not buried in some storeroom, but in a chapel, facing east, the traditional direction of resurrection. An investigation in the 1950s tried to match the statue with existing saints. Historians cross-referenced robes, symbols, posture. They studied old mass books, marginalia, personal journals of clergy. They found a name, Saint Eloria, canonized in 1472, and never mentioned again after 1714. She was said to be a mystic, a young woman who experienced visions, not just of angels or saints, but of structures. She described halls beneath the earth, a corridor beneath the Vatican where light poured upward, a door that could only be opened when heaven stops turning. Eloria's visions gained followers, and her writings were preserved by a small order of nuns who believed she was receiving sacred architectural messages, blueprints, not of buildings, but of hidden truths. She was canonized swiftly. Some said too swiftly. And then, forgotten. Records from 1714 show a sudden council decision. Her name was struck from the liturgical calendar, her feast day dissolved, her writings banned. But why? There's no official explanation, only a brief entry in a private cardinal's letter. She knew too much of what should not be known. The vault must remain sealed. The statue, though, was never removed. Some say it was deliberately left behind, too sacred to destroy, too dangerous to honor. Others believe no one could move it. Attempts to relocate it in 1938 reportedly failed. One report states that machinery broke, another that every attempt to lift it ended with something cold and sharp in the minds of the men trying, as if the air itself resisted the act. Pilgrims still pass by it today. Most don't notice, but those who pause say strange things, that they feel watched, that their thoughts become louder, that for a moment they remember something they've never been told. Her eyes remain closed, but the sculptor, who left no signature, carved a line beneath her feet. There is no memory without witness, a statement, or a warning, perhaps both. So she stands, no name, no day, no voice, but still there, a saint canonized, then erased, and maybe never fully forgotten. The door that was sealed from the inside. In one of the oldest, least visited wings of the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, there's a hallway that no longer appears on maps. Its stone walls are too thick for modern wiring. No tour groups pass through. And though it was once a part of daily life centuries ago, now it sits in silence, under dust, beside a single forgotten door. The door is made of old oak, grayed with age, but still sealed tightly into the wall. No handle, no lock, no hinges visible on either side, no cracks between the frame, and no signs of ever being opened, and yet, someone had been inside. It was discovered during a quiet restoration project in 1963. A team of archivists was tracing old fresco damage in a passage thought to be unused since the 1700s. They followed the painted edges of a crumbling wall and found the outline of a doorway. One archivist leaned in to examine it closer and tapped. It echoed hollow, a space on the other side, but no entry. The Vatican brought in a special preservation team to investigate. They scanned the surrounding stone and confirmed it wasn't a false wall, it was real, and the doorway had never been bricked over or sealed with mortar. It was part of the original stone, entirely flush, but the interior? Empty. Something was behind it. Over the next few weeks, Vatican engineers debated how to approach it without damaging the old structure. Finally, with permission from the archives office, they began cutting a small access panel beside the stone frame through a narrow corner where wiring could be added. After 6 hours of careful cutting, they reached the inner chamber and found something impossible. The room had been sealed from the inside. There were no windows, no tunnels, no other doors, and yet, inside were the remains of a wooden cot, a small iron crucifix, and a book. A handwritten journal. The journal's pages were fragile, half decayed, but still legible in parts. Its author had been a monk. His name never appeared, but the entries were precise. Dates, prayers, descriptions of the room, of days passing, of seasons he could no longer see, and finally, a single line written across a full page. I sealed myself in to silence the sound, no further explanation, no mention of another, and yet, the logs described hearing, of tapping in the stone, of breathing that didn't belong to him, of something that whispered when he tried to sleep. The Vatican called in a team of acoustic specialists. They entered the chamber, now cautiously opened, and took measurements. They found anomalies, sounds that echoed faintly despite no curves in the wall, a temperature drop near the floor, and strange interference with recording devices. Batteries drained, tapes erased, static hissed even when power was off. More disturbing than the room, however, were the footprints, or rather, the lack of them. No footprints led in or out, not in the dust, not in the disturbed floor, only a circular, clean patch beneath the cot, and drag marks, as if something had shifted under the bed again and again toward the wall. A second entry in the journal mentions this. It wants to come through, but not while I'm watching. Security was tightened around the site. The room was measured and sketched, but soon after it was sealed again, this time with steel and cement. The Vatican claimed it was due to structural instability, but internally, a different report circulated. A note from a high-level investigator, unreleased to the public, recorded a strange sound after midnight, a tone, low and sustained, almost like a hum, from inside the room, but the room was empty. Some believe it had been a form of voluntary imprisonment, a monk who sealed himself away in devotion, but no one could explain the complete lack of a seal mechanism, no tools, no internal supports, just the door flush to the wall, as if it had always been part of the stone. The journal, now archived under restriction, ends abruptly, no closing date, no goodbye, just the final sentence, again written across an entire page. If the door opens, do not look at it. Visitors are no longer allowed near the corridor, not because of danger, but because the hallway was never supposed to be there. It doesn't appear on floor plans past 1742, and yet, there it is, stone, dust, door, still sealed, and someone once had been inside. The room of shadows and forgotten paint. Tucked deep within the Vatican's maze-like corridors, there is a room that almost no one talks about. It's small, dim, and unremarkable at first glance. Stone walls, cold floor, the smell of time lingering like old dust on forgotten parchment. Most who pass it assume it's just another utility space, maybe a storeroom, but behind those plain walls, something sleeps, something painted, something old, centuries ago, long before electric lights and velvet ropes. This room was alive with color, with movement, with purpose. Someone came here with brushes and vision, with oils and silence. An unknown artist, whose name has vanished from every record, covered the walls in paint. No signature, no date, no commission logged in any papal archive, just the artwork, and even that had vanished for hundreds of years. Until recently, it started with a strange stain on the ceiling. Maintenance workers doing routine checks noticed discoloration, nothing alarming. But when they scraped away the soot and centuries of grime, colors began to emerge. Red, ochre, gold, and then faces, eyes looking out through the centuries. The painting revealed itself slowly, like a memory returning, a room-sized fresco, hidden beneath the blackened walls. It was not grand like Michelangelo's chapel, nor symmetrical like Raphael's halls. It was raw, expressive, full of human emotion, saints and sinners, angels without halos, soldiers with weary eyes, a woman weeping into the folds of her robe, and a figure, perhaps Christ, perhaps not, stepping barefoot into the unknown. No records tell us who painted it. No initials have been found, but the style suggests a gifted hand, someone trained, someone who may have studied under the masters but never became one. Maybe he was a student, maybe a servant who painted by candlelight when no one was watching. Maybe he was punished, and this was his penance. Or maybe, just maybe, this was a secret commission, a message intended not for popes and kings but for time itself. The Vatican didn't announce the discovery right away. Some things, even in the 21st century, remain sacred by silence. The painting is fragile. Each brushstroke rests on a layer of wall that could crumble with a touch. Conservators work slowly, carefully, sometimes wearing gloves, sometimes using microscopes. They document, they photograph, but even they don't know how deep it goes. Behind every wall could be another layer, another story. It is the quiet that makes it powerful. This isn't a painting meant for crowds. There are no tour guides here, no gift shop just outside. This room lives in the shadows. It has for centuries, and somehow the shadows suit it. The figures on the wall aren't performing. They're not frozen in grandeur. They are simply there, waiting, like someone once painted them and then closed the door forever. We don't know why. Perhaps the artist died before it was finished, or perhaps someone ordered it sealed. There are rumors, of course, that it was heretical, that it showed forbidden scenes, that it blended pagan imagery with scripture. Some say there are symbols hidden in the background, keys, eyes, suns drawn too many times, but nothing has been proven. And perhaps that's for the best, because some rooms are meant to remain quiet. Today a single bulb hangs from the ceiling, not too bright, just enough to see the faces when you step inside. You feel watched, not in a threatening way, but gently, like the walls remember you, like the figures on them were painted for you alone. Time slows down here. Your breath sounds louder. You forget the world above. And the strangest thing of all, the air smells faintly, of turpentine, as if someone just finished painting. 500 years, and still the scent lingers. This is not a room of glory. It is not a room of fame, but it may be one of the most human places in all the Vatican. A space where someone, long forgotten, poured their soul into the stone. Not for wealth, not for power, but simply to create, to leave behind something that would outlive them. And it did. The room of shadows and forgotten paint is not part of any tour. It may never be, but it exists, beneath layers of time, beneath the weight of forgotten history, and the story it tells, it whispers, not shouts, it waits, not demands, and perhaps in that quiet between the cracks of paint and silence, we come closer to the truth than in any gilded hall. The door that wasn't supposed to open. There are places in the world where history isn't just stored, it's sealed. Places so old, so full of hidden weight, that time itself feels slower inside them. The air changes. Footsteps echo differently. Light seems to land a little softer. Beneath one of the most sacred sites on earth, a place walked by millions every year, there's a hallway that ends with a door unlike any other. It's not carved with grandeur or polished with gold. It's unassuming, stone, simple, and for centuries it was not supposed to open. Not because it couldn't, but because it wasn't meant to. For generations, whispers passed quietly through the corridors of the Vatican about that sealed vault. Some said it was built during the earliest days of the Church, when the world was fractured and faith was dangerous. Others believed it was far older, built before the Church even existed, repurposed and reclaimed over time, like so many forgotten things in Rome. But no one ever truly knew what lay behind that door, and no one was allowed to try. In the Vatican, things are rarely rushed. Decisions are layered in tradition, wrapped in silence. And so the door remained undisturbed, quiet, waiting, until one day, something changed. It wasn't a discovery, not really, not at first. It was a feeling, a whisper, a note tucked away in the margin of a 15th century ledger, written by a monk with trembling hands. He had been cataloging relics when he mentioned a chamber lost to oath in stone, sealed by silence, bound by dust. No coordinates, no map, just a reference, a direction. Archivists dismissed it at first, but one scholar, young, patient, and unusually persistent, followed the trail anyway. He combed through records not in Latin, but in fractured dialects of Greek and Aramaic. He traced changes in floor plans that didn't make architectural sense. He noticed places where corridors should have connected but didn't, where walls were thicker than they needed to be, where there was too much empty space on ancient blueprints. And slowly, quietly, he found it. The sealed door wasn't hidden behind a wall or buried under stone. It had been there all along, passed by every day. People just didn't notice it, because they weren't supposed to. It was tucked beneath layers of approval, both spiritual and political. Unlocking it would require more than keys. It would require trust, permission, and an agreement that whatever was found would not be spoken of publicly, not unless it was safe. Months passed, then years, until in a quiet ceremony attended by fewer than a dozen officials, the door was opened. No fanfare, no press, just the sound of ancient hinges moving for the first time in centuries, and what lay beyond was silence. But not empty silence. The kind of silence that feels full, like walking into a room just after someone has left, like entering a dream still echoing from the night before. The chamber was larger than expected. Not a vault, not a tomb, but something in between. Dust covered everything in soft gray layers. Candles had long since melted into stone. The air was dry, still, unbothered. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal, under glass that hadn't cracked or clouded with time, was a book. Not a Bible, not a registry, but a personal journal. Its leather binding was worn but intact. The pages, yellowed but readable, each one filled with careful script, drawn in ink that hadn't faded. The name on the inside cover was unfamiliar. Not a pope, not a saint, just a man, a scribe perhaps, or a keeper of some kind. His notes weren't about miracles or doctrine. They were about silence, about decisions, about fear, about something that had been buried, not in the earth but in the mind. He spoke of a time when records were deliberately misplaced, when truths were too dangerous to protect in daylight, when belief was weaponized, and knowledge had to be hidden, not from enemies, but from friends. He wrote about the door itself, how it had been sealed not to protect what was inside, but to protect the world from needing to confront it. The words were haunting, but not sinister, honest, measured. sleepy even, as if the writer had known his work would be read long after he was gone, and had written not in panic but in peace. Around the room, the walls were carved, not with images but with patterns, rhythms, echoes of older languages, layered one atop another: Hebrew, Latin, Coptic, even fragments of pre-Christian dialects, all saying the same thing in different ways: truth sleeps better in silence. The investigators were not archaeologists. They were theologians, librarians, historians. But as they stood in that chamber, they realized they were uncovering something more human than holy. This wasn't just a lost room. It was a moment, frozen in stone, a decision, left behind. And the more they read, the more they saw a pattern: stories of disagreements, of divisions, of moments when the church was nearly torn apart, not by outsiders, but from within. The journal chronicled how some leaders had chosen to preserve unity by burying conflict, not metaphorically, literally, by building rooms like this one, silent rooms, forgotten rooms, with locked doors and no names. The journal hinted at others, too. Rooms beneath France, beneath Jerusalem, beneath the old ruins in Carthage. Whether they still existed, no one knew. But this one had opened, and once opened, it could never be truly sealed again. The scholars debated what to do, whether to reveal what they'd found, whether to share the journal, whether to acknowledge the room at all. In the end, they chose silence, not out of fear, but out of respect. The journal was moved, but the room remained, preserved, undisturbed, and the door was gently closed once more. But this time, not locked, because now, someone knew, and maybe, someday, someone would return.